Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. If you are preparing for UPSC, SSC or any state level examination, then today's topic is extremely important because it combines history, international relations and current affairs. Recently, the United States President Donald Trump invoked something called Monroe Doctrine while referring to an aggressive American action in the Western Hemisphere. He even gave it a new name, that is the Donroe Doctrine. So this instantly brought a 200-year-old foreign policy principle back into a global discussion. So the question is simple but very important for our exam. What is Monroe Doctrine and why does it still matters today? To understand this key concept, we need go back to the year of 1823. On December 2, 1823, the fifth President of United States, James Monroe, made a historic declaration before the US Congress. This declaration later came to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. If you try to understand this concept, the core of this concept, what we can say that the Monroe Doctrine was a warning to the European power. The James Monroe made it clear that any attempt by the Europe to intervene in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. In a simple term, what we can say that America were no longer open for the European colonization or political manipulation. To explain this warning more clearly, James Monroe structured his policy around a few clear principles rather than vague threats. We can say that this doctrine rested on three important key pillars. First, non-colonization, which means Europe must not establish a new colony in America. Second, non-intervention. That means European powers must stay out of the political affairs in the Western Hemisphere. Third, separate spheres of influence. That to mean what we can say that Europe and America would operate in different political worlds. But the important point here that initially, this doctrine wasn't defensive in nature. It is because the United States was still a young power and they wanted to protect the newly independent Latin American nation from the European domination. But over the time, the meaning of Monroe Doctrine began to change. By mid-19th century, this doctrine was no longer just about keeping Europe out of it. It had started to justify the American influence and intervention in the region. For a clear example, what we can talk about which an incident which has happened in 1865 when the US supported the Mexican President Benito against the Emperor Maximilian who have been installed by the France. With the US diplomatic and the military pressure, the Benito succeeded with reinforcing the idea that US would decide what happened in its hemisphere. And other example, what we can say that this doctrine took even more aggressive turn in 1904 under the Roosevelt. At that time, what we can say that the European countries were threatening to use their force against the Latin American to recover their unpaid debts. Here, the Roosevelt responded with what became known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He declared that the United States had the right to act as the international police power in the Western Hemisphere to prevent instability or chronic watchdog. This justification led to the direct US military intervention, which means the American Marines were sent to the Santo Domingo in 1904, Nicaragua in 1911 and Haiti in 1950, officially to keep Europe out but effectively to expand the American control. Here the important point that not surprisingly the Latin American countries viewed this action with suspicion. While the Monroe Doctrine claimed to protect the sovereignty, in practice it often undermined it. So the doctrine, for another example that I can say again, that the doctrine surfaced again during the Cold War also, especially in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Soviet Union, they began to installing the nuclear missiles in Cuba, the United States invoked the Monroe Doctrine symbolically with the backing of Organization of American States. The President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval and air blockade around the Cuba. After several tense days, the Soviet Union withdrew their missiles and the crisis ended, which reinforcing the doctrine's role in limiting the extra-regional powers in America. Now fast forward to the present. We know that President Donald Trump has revived the Monroe Doctrine in much more aggressive form. He has reinforced it while justifying the actions in Latin America, and he has openly spoken about the US dominance in the Western Hemisphere, even rebranding it as the Donroe Doctrine. This revival become even more interesting when we look at the Donald Trump push to annexize the Greenland. We know that the Greenland is a semi-autonomous territory of Denmark, a NATO ally of United States. Yet, the Donald Trump has repeatedly expressed his interest in bringing Greenland under the US control, and he has not ruled out the use of a military force. Here the point that you should understand why Greenland now targeted by the Donald Trump. One of the important point it is because the Greenland site a strategic location between Europe and North America, which was making a critical for the US ballistic missile defense. Second point, it is also rich in rare earth metals, which align with the Washington goal of reducing the dependence on Chinese supply chain. In 2025, there was a tension which was increased when the Danish officials were summoned by the US ambassador after report of covert influence operation in Greenland. The Donald Trump later appointed a special envoy who openly support the Greenland integration to the United States. At the same time, the Denmark and Greenland strongly rejected these moves, with stating clearly that Greenland is not for sale. And they also got support from Russia and several European countries. They opposed the US position regarding the Greenland acquisition. Here, to conclude my discussion regarding the Monroe Doctrine, for an exam point of view, the aspirants must take key important points from this discussion. One, the Monroe Doctrine began as an anti-colonial defensive policy, but over 2 centuries, it has evolved into a tool for American strategic dominance. Second, it has been repeatedly reshaped to suit the US geopolitical interests, from European colony threats to the Cold War rivalries, and now to resource competition and Arctic geopolitics. Third, when modern leaders invoke the Monroe Doctrine, they are not just referring to the history, they are invoking a long tradition of US interventionism. And this is exactly why the Monroe Doctrine remains relevant for the international relations, global power politics, and contemporary current affairs. Thank you for listening. I hope this session helped you to understand not only what the Monroe Doctrine is, but also how the 19th century policy continue to shape the 21st century geopolitics. Stay focused, keep revising, and I will see you in the next session. Thank you.